Hands Off Eritrea, a Horn of Africa TV editorial. Today is Wednesday, February 10, 2021. The US and the European Union should stop their unwarranted hegemonic meddling in the Horn of Africa, which is undermining the region's peace and stability. Recently, there has been unwarranted attacks on Eritrea from the US and the European Union. On February 4, 2021, the US Embassy in Eritrea issued a statement through its Facebook page, making a demand on the Eritrean government to withdraw its forces from Tigray immediately. This is very strange and against the norms of diplomatic conduct governed by the Vienna Convention. Strange also because there is no independent sovereign country in the region called Tigray. Ethiopia is the neighboring country of Eritrea, of which Tigray is a province or regional state or Klil. Tigray, the northernmost province, is part and parcel of Ethiopia. The Ethiopian government has not claimed that it has been invaded by Eritrea. So, does the US support the objective or claim that Tigray is an independent country? For how else can it call on Eritrea to withdraw from Tigray in total disregard of the sovereign government of Ethiopia? The US Embassy then continues its baseless allegations in its Facebook statement, saying, "We have conveyed our grave concerns about credible reports of human rights abuses committed by Eritrean forces and other actors in Tigray." The US Embassy further calls for independent investigations of these alleged abuses. This bizarre accusation of the US Embassy in Asmara makes the charge first, assumes guilt, and subsequently calls for independent investigation. What we have here is the Kafkaesque Twilight zone of the US Embassy, in which guilt is always assumed first, and investigation or trial follows merely to formalize guilt. No wonder then that former Ecuadorian President Rafael Correa, quoting former Bolivian President Evo Morales, said in a 2012 interview with Julian Assange, "The only country to be sure never to have a coup d'etat is the United States, because it doesn't have a US embassy." Predictably, the European Union also followed suit and issued a similar statement 4 days later on February 8. Quote, "The EU joins the United States' call for withdrawal of Eritrean troops from Ethiopia, which are fueling the conflict in Tigray, reportedly committing atrocities and exacerbating ethnic violence." End of quote. These on the eve of the EU's fact-finding mission to Ethiopia. Again, when it comes to Africa, facts are always what the US and EU say they are. Facts are not discovered on the ground, but rather declared by faraway hegemonic powers to suit their interests. And here too, as in Kafka's famous novel, The Trial, guilt is always assumed beforehand. But what are the facts surrounding recent events in Tigray in northern Ethiopia? First, on November 4, 2020, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, which has been ruling Tigray and was in conflict with the central authority of the federal government of Ethiopia, launched a preemptive attack in the dead of the night on several Ethiopian National Defense Forces military bases stationed in Tigray, killing hundreds of federal soldiers in their sleep and capturing thousands of others. This was admitted by TPLF officials themselves on their own television broadcast. The purpose, as the TPLF officials admitted, was to capture strategic long-range rocket missiles and heavy weaponry from the Federal Army bases. Many surviving soldiers of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces who withstood the TPLF assaults fought back and retreated to neighboring Eritrea, where they were welcomed warmly, clothed and fed, and given shelter until they were able to rejoin their units in Tigray for a counterattack. As Ethiopia's Prime Minister, Dr. Abiy Ahmed, later reported in his parliamentary victory speech on November 30, 2020, the Ethiopian army regrouped quickly and launched a devastating counterattack in a law enforcement operation in Tigray against the TPLF. During the fighting between the federal troops and the TPLF militias and special forces, the TPLF fired several rockets towards Eritrea's capital, Asmara, as well as Gondar and Bahr Dar, two major cities of the Amhara region of Ethiopia. These brazen attacks against civilian targets in Ethiopia and Eritrea were duly condemned at that time by the United States and the European Union. In a press briefing on November 17, then US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said, I quote, "The United States strongly condemns the attack carried out by the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, on the airport in Asmara, Eritrea on November 14. We are deeply concerned by this blatant attempt by the TPLF to cause regional instability by expanding its conflict with Ethiopian authorities to neighboring countries. We also continue to denounce the TPLF's November 13 missile attacks on Bahr Dar and Gondar airports in Ethiopia." The Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, continued his press statement saying, "We strongly urge the TPLF and Ethiopian authorities to take immediate steps to de-escalate the conflict, restore peace, and protect civilians. We appreciate Eritrea's restraint, which has helped to prevent further spreading of the conflict." End of quote. Eritrea, despite clearly being the victim of TPLF's aggression at that time, was praised by US Secretary Pompeo for its show of restraint. Eritrea had legitimate grounds to react and to take appropriate defensive countermeasures against the TPLF. But Eritrea was being praised for not being provoked by TPLF's brazen attacks and showing instead maximum restraint. These are the facts of recent events. Furthermore, it has been proven that the TPLF was making all kinds of war preparations before November 2020. Its textile factory called Almeda Charkachark, for example, had been producing army uniforms of both the Eritrean Defense Forces and the Ethiopian National Defense Forces. Why? Well, as it became apparent later, as it was being routed by the Ethiopian army, it released 13,000 criminals from its jailhouses in Mekelle and other cities of Tigray, dressed them up as Eritrean soldiers, and let them loose on the civilian population of Tigray. Also, some of the TPLF militias dressed as Eritrean soldiers were looting and plundering and committing all kinds of atrocities. Furthermore, defeated TPLF forces destroyed Aksum Airport, Adigrat pharmaceutical plant, universities, roads and bridges, and other vital infrastructure as they retreated towards Mekelle. Après moi, le déluge, as the saying goes. These are the criminal deeds of TPLF documented by the Office of Ethiopia's Attorney General and recently presented in a press briefing in Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia. At the beginning of the conflict in early November 2020, TPLF militias and gang of violent Tigrayan youth called Samri had committed a rampant selected massacre of Amhara civilians in a town called Maikadra near the Sudanese border in what was then Western Tigray in Kafta Humera. Hundreds of Amhara workers and members of other ethnic groups, mostly migrant laborers in commercial farms, were selectively targeted and killed by these Samri youth gangs with knives and guns and buried in mass graves. This massacre, which amounted to genocide, was later investigated and corroborated by the independent Ethiopian Human Rights Council. Some of the criminal Tigrayan genocidaires of the group called Samri were apprehended and are awaiting trial. But most of the Samri criminal gang members fled by crossing the border to the neighboring Sudan and are currently hiding in the refugee camps there, masquerading as civilians. None of these acts of genocide and crimes against humanity committed by the TPLF and its armed thugs were condemned by the US and the European Union and other human rights organizations. They were merely glossed over, or these crimes were projected to either Eritrea or the Ethiopian Army or Amhara Special Forces. This is the classic case of inverting the victim and the aggressor, a propaganda modus operandi of the Western media and its political operatives. Many citizens of Eritrean descent in the United States and Europe have been outraged by these latest assaults on Eritrea and are condemning the smear campaign by the US and the European Union. The National Council of Eritrean Americans, for example, issued a statement on February 7, and we quote excerpts from it at length. Begin quote, "The recent ill-advised statement from the US Embassy in Asmara with regards to Eritrea felt like a slap in the face for the hundreds of thousands of Eritrean Americans in the United States. We are profoundly disappointed to see such a statement which points to a past of failed US policies, not a future of possibilities of working together in improved US-Eritrea relations. The policies of the past 2 decades were largely driven by relentless campaigns of lies generated and orchestrated by the Tigray People's Liberation Front when it was in power in Ethiopia. We fear the current trend, as indicated by this week's statement, may also be influenced by a similar campaign, this time around driven by the remnants of the TPLF, abusing channels of international diplomacy they had cultivated when they controlled Ethiopia's foreign policy. We take no pleasure when we point out that the failed US policies towards Eritrea of the recent past, according to the WikiLeaks embassy cables leading to the 2009 sanctions, were partially based on relentless wave of deliberate disinformation and misinformation originating from the US embassy in Asmara, recycling and laundering, as the cables show, lazy innuendos about Eritrea compiled from TPLF-operated websites. Similarly, as the Ethiopian Attorney General stated a few days ago, the TPLF, in a premeditated attempt to internationalize its anticipatory war against the Ethiopian National Defense Forces based in Tigray, had made the uniforms of Eritrean security forces and distributed them to its special forces, militia, and criminals in order to frame Eritrea. As early as 1 week after the start of the internal Ethiopian conflict on November 4, 2020, a BBC News analysis summarized in its Ethiopia's Great Tigray conflict sparks spread of misinformation, exposed how pictures from different countries as far as Armenia and Russia and as near as Yemen were photoshopped by TPLF supporters to peddle their lies. Later in December and January, more pictures from different countries were collected from the internet and dished out as if they were evidence of atrocities happening in Tigray, and TPLF supporters were openly boasting in social media how to exploit the gullibility of some policy makers. An example is the little girl whose picture was taken from social media and presented as a child killed in Adigrat, Tigray, Ethiopia. The poor girl was forced to post on Facebook stating that she is alive and well in California. The Washington Post on February 5, 2021 stated how in Ethiopia's digital battle over the Tigray region, facts are casualties, lamenting Twitter accounts with opaque credentials, claiming expertise or positions aimed at boosting their credibility. They claim to be academics or aid workers, but have little or no online presence beyond Twitter, making their credentials difficult to verify. These accounts may be problematic because they can obtain significant reach based on unsubstantiated claims. Earlier in November, the Post had written, quote, hate speech and disinformation have spread rapidly among politicized groups in Ethiopia, end of quote. In fact, the disinformation campaign in Ethiopia is so rampant that some PhD candidates are now using it as a topic for dissertation research. We would also like to point out the hypocrisy that it's apparent when a permutation of some Obama-era officials who had no moral courage at that time to ask the TPLF-led Ethiopian government to immediately vacate sovereign Eritrean territories that it was occupying in breach of an international treaty, which the US was a witness and a guarantor of, are now rearing their familiar biased heads in yet another administration to accuse Eritrea when the Ethiopian government is telling the world, quote, the TPLF itself started the war with the calculation of how the process should be internationalized to claim that foreign countries have joined forces with the Ethiopian army, end of quote. Both the United States and the European Union statements conveniently forget the toxic policy of institutionalized ethnicity and polarization that the now defunct TPLF clique pursued for decades in Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa region, and the vicious cycle of violence and mayhem that this had entailed. The TPLF clique continued to occupy even after the historic 2018 Asmara peace agreement between Eritrea and Ethiopia, sovereign Eritrean territories in flagrant breach of international law, and the Algiers peace agreement that the United States, European Union, and other powers had brokered and guaranteed. In all these instances, the United States and the European Union shrugged off their moral obligations and continued to funnel billions of dollars in budgetary and other fungible assistances, as well as political and diplomatic cover to the TPLF clique, which increasingly emboldened it to indulge in reckless acts. Are some in the United States and the European Union desperately trying to save the TPLF at this moment? If so, that's a futile dream, as the TPLF cannot now be resurrected from the dead. The forward motion of the wheels of history in our region cannot be reversed. Time for the United States and the European Union to review their policies instead of accusing Eritrea. It is time for the Western powers of hegemony to give peace, stability, and cooperation a chance to grow and blossom in the new Horn of Africa, instead of being obstructionist interventionists that perpetuate the bitter legacy of war and destruction. Thank you for watching. This has been a presentation of Horn of Africa TV editorial. Please don't forget to subscribe, like if you like, and share widely. Until next time, I'm Elias Amare. Salam.